Well, good afternoon. I'm Julia Taylor with the Greater Milwaukee Committee, and I want to thank you for being here today. We all got to see Monday night with Mike Gousha for many years, and we're trying a different variation today of Tuesday lunch with Mike. And we're looking forward to pretty interesting dialogue occurring. I want to acknowledge some of our special guests that are here today. We've got Carol Schneider, who's a Milwaukee 7 council member and CEO of SEEK. Richard Telfer, who's the newest member of the Milwaukee 7 Council, interim chancellor at UW-Whitewater. Jackie Avery Alboy, who's the senior director of affiliate services for the National Urban League. And we also, I think we have James Bohl here, who's the alderman. James, are you here? Nope, okay. Dave Brandt's here for him. And I want to take a minute, too, today and thank Argosy Foundation. Chris Abele was a co-chair of our county fiscal situation committee last year and has agreed to continue to support our efforts looking at regionalism and what it means for us. And so we want to thank Argosy Foundation for the funding today. So we're here to discuss regionalism and our efforts this far and how are we coming out on the map. We've been working hard to bring government officials, the business leaders, and the people in the community together in a more cohesive manner than what we've had before to create that platform for change. We've established a structure that will help the region become more globally competitive. We've developed a strategic framework to use when following these goals, and we've assessed our assets. And we've also formed a good collaborative structure at the staff side. We've got Pat O'Brien here today from MMAC, who's done a lot of work through Milwaukee Development Corp., and Dean Amhouse with the Spirit of Milwaukee, who are kind of our cohorts in crime and keeping this moving forward, and appreciate their hard work. But every region evolves on its own path, and so we want to learn today from the experiences of other successful regions that are today's economic powerhouses and how we start to move our region along those lines. So I'd like to introduce Mike Gousha, who's the Distinguished Fellow of Law and Public Policy, Marquette University Law School, and former local news anchor. And he's going to interview our special guest that we're privileged to have here today, David Thornburgh. And David's the former president and CEO of the Alliance for Regional Stewardship and a current senior advisor for the eConsult Corporation, a Philadelphia-based regional economic development consulting firm. And I've heard David speak before, and he's got some pretty interesting insights about what's happening around the country. So he's here to share those experiences and his insights with us today. So I want to turn the program over to Mike and to David. Thank you.
Looks like they're already on. See if I can remember how to do this with my past life. Thanks again for being with us today. We do appreciate it. We understand that getting here was a little bit of a challenge because of some traffic problems on I-43, so we appreciate your efforts to be with us today. I thought we would begin by just getting some impressions from David of Milwaukee, what he's learned about our community, because I think that's a helpful place for us to start. What do you know about the city? What is your impression of this community?
Put the guy from outside on the spot right away. I actually have I have a great fondness for this place. I was telling you earlier, I have a bunch of different connections to this city and this region. I lived in the North Shore of Chicago for a couple years and visited here pretty often. And I have a cousin who's lived here for 20 or 25 years, who's a professor at the university. And I have to say, you should know also that I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, which I think has some sort of psychic similarities to Milwaukee. I'm a big believer that in this game of competing at the regional scale, that the world's going to reward authenticity. And I'm coming from a place, as I said, that Pittsburgh, that I think has that quality. So the quirky, the real, the familiar, the proud. Those are all characteristics those are impressions that I have of Milwaukee. This is a place that people care about, have deep roots in. are very interested and committed to its future. Certainly the passions around sports, and I would say I've always thought of Milwaukee having a very interesting and eclectic cultural scene, which is again one of those expressions of authenticity. So if I were in your shoes, I would be quite optimistic about your future, which isn't to say that getting there is necessarily a walk in the park, but there's a lot of good building blocks here.
You're familiar with the Milwaukee 7 organization here, the initiative that is considered crucial to economic development in this region. And yet, I think it might be safe to say that there's an impression that somehow Milwaukee is behind the curve in terms of regional cooperation. Is that, are we the exception, or are a lot of cities exactly where we are at this moment in time?
Well, I'll repeat the quick comment I made at the table. There is out there around the country this sort of, everywhere you go, people think that somebody else out there is doing a lot better than they are. And not just on the raw numbers, but in terms of their ability to organize and collaborate and build leadership around community issues. And that's simply not the case. There are lots of communities out there who are all at various kind of steps on the places on the hill. They're doing different things and drawing on their particular strengths. Having said that, I actually am, from what I've learned about the Milwaukee 7 effort and the Greater Milwaukee Committee and a lot of the things that seem to be going on here, I'm pretty impressed. For one, I said this to Julie, I think the Milwaukee 7 name is brilliant. It somehow, it clearly expresses the collaborative nature of the enterprise, but it's also got a little kind of a 007 sort of intrigue to it. I was trying to remember what the organization was that James Bond was a part of. You know, it's something like that. Mm-hmm. But you need a sense of conspiracy, actually, I think, to sort of join common cause around this. But, you know, beyond that, beyond just the identity and the naming, really being thoughtful about an agenda that's not 68 different points, but literally 2 or 3 things that the community needs to tackle over the course of the next 10 or 15 years. I think that's an important instinct, and it seems to be one that this effort is embracing and following. It's not just sort of flailing around and trying to do a little bit of everything.
How difficult is it to reach consensus on what should be done next in terms of regional cooperation? We've got issues here involving water, transportation, tax structure. How do you find consensus when you have, for example, 7 different counties, all with their own interests involved?
Yeah. Well, I've spent about the last 20 years living and working in Philadelphia, which, if you know anything about its Quaker heritage, which is every decision in the Quaker tradition is arrived at by consensus. It's a very challenging way of decision making, but ultimately, if you can reach that, it's very powerful. And if you, my kids actually go to a Quaker school and have for years and years, and watching the influence of particular individuals in the decision-making setting is really fascinating. And I think there's a basic truth about any kind of collaborative process, which is that you draw on people who are trusted and respected, who clearly have roots in the community. What we've found, and this is sort of the premise of the Alliance for Regional Stewardship, those folks can come from lots of different sectors. They can come from the business community, they can come from the political community, they can come from the religious community. This could be the head of the community foundation or a United Way or what have you. But your ability to reach that kind of consensus, which is, I think, is much improved when you can draw on those kind of people, as one person termed them, community connectors. These are people who can cross boundaries between county and county, city and suburb, private sector, public sector, and that's really, I think, the key to driving this kind of decision making, which is so important.
There are different approaches, and let's talk about some of the approaches that are available as you try and cooperate on regional issues. And there are different examples. We hear a lot about cities like Louisville or Indianapolis or sometimes the Twin Cities or Denver. Can you lay out a couple examples of regional cooperation strategies that seem to be fairly effective, that you point to and say, here are communities that are doing some interesting and effective things?
Sure. Well, in classic American fashion, there are lots of great experiments around the country. I mean, you mentioned Denver. Denver stands out in two respects. One is they've had, for the better part of, I'm going to guess, 15 years, a regional fund that supports arts, culture, and science. They've also, and he's now just elected to his second term, had a mayor, John Hickenlooper, who's really embraced the role of mayor as a regional leader. And they've built and sustained a Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, where Hickenlooper plays a role but invites the mayors and significant elected officials from around the region to join in that to advance the issues which you can't really get at otherwise individually. Mayor Daley in Chicago has also a Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, which I think is a really and as does Mayor Franklin in Atlanta. Building that kind of table for elected officials, and you can do it in lots of different ways. In Pittsburgh, they've had for about 20 years, the university has created something called the Institute of Politics. And there they have an annual retreat of elected officials, and they have working groups going forward. And this is to tackle the big issues, the water and sewer issues, the infrastructure issues, which no one elected official can get at by himself or herself. Just a comment on the kind of the high visibility structural approaches. The Louisville, where you go back literally decades now to UniGov in Indianapolis, or in Miami, the sort of structural consolidation. Although I'd point out, Philadelphia was the first city that had a massive consolidation, and they did that in 1854, where literally with a stroke of a legislative pen eliminated 27 different municipalities and combined them into the city of Philadelphia, with, by the way, no local referendum on that. This was the state legislature at work. So I think they poisoned the well for subsequent efforts in doing that. These are sort of the poster, what some people perceive as the poster children of regional efforts, and I think that's a little misguided in a sense that there's a huge spectrum of efforts that go into that category of regional collaboration, and this is just one of them. I think it's interesting in almost every case, a good bit of the impetus that resulted in that was a city that had lost population and wanted to play on a bigger scale. And then they entered into the process to bring in the surrounding counties. When you go to the research literature, the story of efficiency is not always clear. It's not as if we had 27 school districts and 27 health districts or whatever. We combined them all and we saved 30% overall. It's murkier than that. Having said that, the biggest advantage is sort of what refers to what I said a second ago. When Louisville went through that, and the chair of the Alliance for Regional Stewardship was the deputy mayor of Louisville, it really was a landmark event that instilled a new sense of pride and confidence in citizens. that Louisville went from being the 57th largest city to the 16th largest city overnight. Now, that's just psychology, but it's important psychology.
How do you break down the barriers, though? You use Louisville as an example, and I don't know enough about the history of Louisville, but I can speak to the history of Milwaukee,
Right.
and you have some lingering, I think it's safe to say animosity might be the right word, between city and suburbs. It dates probably back to even the days of Henry Meyer, a former mayor who clashed with the suburbs, or even a more recent mayor, John Norquist, who belittled certain development in the suburbs. You've got some resentment there, and yet you're trying to move forward together. How do you break down the barriers? How do you do that in a way that doesn't take 30 or 40 years? I mean, something that needs to be done now.
Well, you know, the historical answer is it usually does take 30 or 40 years. I mean, to execute something on the scale of Louisville. Now, I mean, this was the referendum that created their merged Jefferson County Louisville government was I think the fourth try over 30 years, the direct referendum. Now, there are a couple interesting lessons. Louisville went to a countywide school district forced by desegregation issues in the mid-'80s. So they already had tackled in one area this consolidation, so people had some familiarity with that. Frankly, they also had and have a very popular, very approachable kind of ball of fire mayor, Jerry Abramson, who people trusted. They have no term limits in Louisville. He's been elected, I think, 4 or 5 times now. He's sort of a mayor for life. He won last time with about 80% of the vote. So, you know, those are ingredients. And just to reflect a second on the school district example, a legislator said to me once, he said, when you're introducing what looks like a new idea to elected officials, he said, try to find an example in some other area of something that they've already approved that looks like this new idea. So it's making a new idea look not so new, which I thought was a very good piece of advice. To say, hey, all we're trying to do here with Parks and Recreation is what we did with libraries 20 years ago, and you voted for that, remember? And it's been very popular and so forth. Or we're trying to do with transit simply what we did with parks, and you know, look at the history of how that was received in the community and so forth. And so on.
A Milwaukee analogy might be if you look at the consolidation of fire departments on the North Shore, where all of a sudden there is a North Shore fire department, and I guess that could be the type of thing you're talking about replicating. You're saying here's mutual cooperation. We understand that we can all benefit from this. We might be more efficient. We might be less expensive.
Well, I think let's just acknowledge that elected officials are generally risk averse. Therefore, by the way, people are too. Robert Kennedy's line that everybody loves progress and hates change, you know. So on the way into changes like this, there's more than a little anxiety about what might happen and the political ramifications and the consequences and so forth. And if in fact you can reflect on something that you already did 20 or 30 years ago and suggest that it really wasn't so bad, or even that there was some political upside to that, I think you're much better off. And it just lowers the threshold of anxiety all the way around.
What's a better sell, David? If you're talking about regional cooperation, is it better to say this will increase efficiency, or is it better to say this will save money, period?
Well, I'm going to borrow a line from your Mayor Norquist, who I know you said was no fan of these regional issues, but...
No, he's a fan. I think he just had some issues, perhaps with the suburbs. That would be a better way of putting it.
Right. But I saw him speak a number of years ago, and this was on the subject of government performance, and he was caught up in this. This was in the mid-'90s when the Reinventing Government book was out. And he said, you know, this is all about improving the lives of citizens and voters, the people that I represent. So And I think if you can keep bringing the message home to that person, that family, and make it as personal, even emotional as possible. This is about, in whatever area you're talking about. If it's transit, it's making sure that a family that lives over here can have all the access to jobs and cultural and recreational and educational opportunities for themselves and their kids as possible. And then, in fact, you'd be doing them a disservice if you didn't make that possible. So it really is, they say there's sort of the efficiency arguments, which is about saving money, and their effectiveness arguments, which are really about doing the right thing. I think the more effective arguments for regional problem solving are not about saving money, which in the wrong hands also sounds sort of mean-spirited somehow, but also can be very vulnerable to the noise of research. You can always find somebody. If you said we save 10%, you can always find somebody who said no, the cost will go up 15%, and then the net result is confusion. So I think if you can focus on basic things that will clearly improve the lives of people in different communities, and sell that in lots of different creative ways, I think that you're on the right track.
You talked about leadership being key to making regional cooperation a success. You also mentioned that elected officials tend to be risk adverse. How do you persuade an elected official that discussing regionalism, which I think you don't even like that word, regionalism,
right.
How do you persuade them that discussing this, talking about it,
okay.
advocating for it, is okay? When they know, they've heard the old Tip O'Neill expression, all politics
right.
are local.
That's right.
They worry about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. And by the way, that's a condition or a dynamic that you are by no means alone. Everybody has that sort of thing. Well, there I go back to a comment I made earlier, is that there is message and there is messenger. And in this case, one of the things that in the kind of the grand design of moving this ball forward is you need to understand in not a nefarious way, but just in a kind of a strategic sense, what people do those elected officials turn to for insight or advice? Who do they trust? And oftentimes they're going to be the kinds of these community connectors that I talked about earlier, people who have long-standing interest and commitment, and by and large, do things because they need to be done, not because it's a quick political one here or there. So enlisting those folks as champions for a particular issue and bringing their stature, frankly, to the conversation with an elected official. And the easiest example is a time-honored one, which is if you're a business person and your market area spans 5 or 6 different counties, 7 counties, or your employees are drawn from those counties, your interests cross the political boundaries, and therefore you should be able to speak to the elected officials in each one of those, and your voice will carry some weight. So, at the end of the day, and this is sort of sounds like a throwaway line, but it's just fundamentally important. Identifying the champions, the message carriers, the people who can cross those boundaries with elected officials is just fundamentally important. And this is not a staff exercise. This is not. And I used to run an organization where I played that staff role. You can't expect those folks to bridge those boundaries nearly as well as those people of stature and breadth can.
Can you give us some more ideas on ways, and I guess these would qualify as small steps, but ways that you begin to move toward cooperation that seem to be effective? Yeah. I know you talk about things like regional purchasing, things that may not be quite as bold as some of these other things we've talked about, but begin to take you down that path.
Right. Well, it's a there's a basic tool if you've ever been subjected to a consultant or been in the consulting business, they're sort of, they make great use of these 2x2 matrices. And on this matrix, you know, one, in this instance, one axis is the potential impact of any particular initiative, and the other one is how hard is it going to be to accomplish. Often what happens in this sort of game is that people fix on things that they can do, but frankly don't have a whole lot of impact. And you can often tell that in the press announcement for, you know, this initiative, someone will say, well, this is just the beginning. Unfortunately, it's often the beginning and the end. It's just all we've been able to accomplish is that, you know, 2 counties have shared a snowplow, or that we've, you know, both agreed to, you know, align our personnel systems in some way. The trick, though, is the persistence over time that really knits together a series of those small steps headed towards something that really does have significant impact. And here, you know, I was reading one of the clips from Julia's website about folks that have been following this conversation here, and it really is the stick-to-itiveness over time. You really do need people and organizations and leaders who are paying attention, who see every time there's an opportunity to advance for the good of the community, advance some new move of that brings 2 counties together, that brings 7 counties together, city and suburbs together. And this could be when somebody, you know, you pick the opportunity points when somebody retires, or there's an election, or there's something that happens politically, and you use those opportunities to keep advancing the issue. It's one of those sort of persistent pressure relentlessly applied. And you'd like to think, we all get impatient with that. We think like, why couldn't we just get this done? Why don't we know exactly what we need to do? Why don't we just get it done and get it over with, and then we'll join all the ranks of all the folks that are doing this well. Unfortunately, and maybe sometimes this is a strength, that the system doesn't work that way. You really have to work. You kind of simultaneously have to identify the steps that you can take at any given time, and then keep taking them over time.
You've talked about messaging. How important, and this feeds off your last statement, how important is it to publicly tout the progress that is being made, the successes that have been achieved? How important would you say that is?
I think that's hugely important. As I said earlier, somehow around the country, kind of wherever you go, there seems to be this notion that we're not keeping up with the Joneses, and that the Joneses are doing doing very well, but it's somewhere else. And I think partly that is because the community, and people like to blame the media, but it's, you know, we're all
Do they? I hadn't heard that.
Well, never in your entire career.
Never.
But it's really important to recognize the victories along the way. I mean, that's just basic human nature, is that your stick-to-itiveness is fed by that sense that you're actually accomplishing things. And I don't think there's any perfect way to do it. I mean, there's awards, there's banquets, there's personal notes, there's anything and everything. And I think that's part of the sort of virtuous cycle that you can get into.
One of the things that I've heard discussed by a GMC member here, Sheldon Lubar, is his belief that there's a need for a metropolitan Milwaukee fiscal control board. In other words, an entity that essentially has to sign off on the budgets that are presented by the many different taxing authorities that we have here, whether they be a technical college or the public schools or whatever. Is that being done in other cities around the country that you know of, that sort of thing?
Not that I know of. I mean, there are a number of cities that, because they teetered on the verge of bankruptcy, have installed fiscal control boards. I mean, Philadelphia has one, Pittsburgh has one, New York has had one for 30 years now. But I'm not aware of a metropolitan. I mean, that role is often played by kind of watchdog civic groups. The organization that I ran before the Alliance was a group called the Pennsylvania Economy League, which was kind of a classic progressive era institution, business-led, and for a good period of time in the 50s and 60s, we essentially played that fiscal watchdog role, that kind of gotcha role. So we'd review the annual budgets or the capital expenditures or the bond issues or whatever. And you know, I didn't find that when I, began running the organization, didn't find that to be a satisfying role. It felt like too much, kind of tisking about what we shouldn't do and not enough energy put into what we should be doing. And that's also the historic role of the news media. I'm concerned now that given what's going on in the media business, that they're not equipped as well to play that role. But I mean, that's the time-honored tradition of sort of playing gotcha, or look at the massive salary increases, or the tomfoolery with the pension fund, or there's an article in today's paper about I guess some county pension back and forth issues. So I think if you have a well-functioning local regional news media, and you have some civic capacity to play that watchdog role, and a general willingness to speak out when necessary, business leaders and so forth, that should be sufficient. And again, I don't know of anyone around the country that's got that at a regional scale.
I think that you have said this, or if not others have said this, but that the single strongest motivating factor in accomplishing regional cooperation is crisis.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can put it.
Right.
You're facing a crisis and you feel you have to do something.
Yeah.
Is that the way these things tend to happen?
For better, for worse, yeah. And I think about, one of the great skills, I think, of leaders, but maybe particular elected officials, is, as someone said, they're like good surfers. They're out there riding the waves, and then all of a sudden they see one coming, and they pick that wave, and they get a great ride out of it. And a crisis is clear, whether it's a fiscal crisis, a natural disaster, economic downturn. It is like one of those waves that you can catch. So part of the art of change in this whole context is really picking the right wave. If you think about reports and scorecards and benchmarks and how are we doing, I know Deloitte just did recently a kind of a benchmark analysis of the Milwaukee regional economy. All of those are designed to illuminate either crises or opportunities. And that's really what a report does, or that kind of analysis. Human nature, as I said, for better, for worse, seems to respond more urgently to crises than opportunities. It's sort of like you would need an opportunity that's 10 times greater than a threat to evoke the same kind of response. You'd like to think that that's not really, that feels like a shallow version of leadership, but I unfortunately think that's true. The only qualifier said that if you have people who can stay on the case over time and really keep their eye, they're going to be seeing the long-term objective, that we've got to invest in the transformation of our manufacturing economy, and to see it in a new way and invest it in a new way. Maybe what you do is you keep that kind of opportunity in mind, and then along the way you either manufacture or you take advantage of crises in pursuit of that objective.
This is, I guess, a learning experience. What are the most common pitfalls to avoid when you are initiating an effort designed to enhance regional cooperation? Are there things that you see, David, where these things fall apart because of X, Y, and Z?
Well, here's an obvious one that I will, I'll even name a name because I'm hundreds of miles away from home. Our mayor, John Street, was elected to his second term 4 years ago and decided in his transition, he formed some transition teams and decided that one of the things he wanted to highlight in his next administration was some kind of regional cooperation, so forth and so on. So they developed a report and he got some co-chairs and so forth and so on. And then he decided to call together essentially the equivalent of the county executives from the four surrounding counties and brought them together. And mistake one is I don't believe he'd ever met them or talked to them before. So this was essentially, summoned to the throne. And then to make it worse, when he summoned to the throne, it was a press conference that they didn't know about. It was the television lights and the print media and so forth. And literally one of the other elected officials said, and I can imagine the tone in his voice, said, "I am never coming back to this." Okay? So that's just sort of, if you remember Highlights for Children magazine, there was Goofus and Gallant, right? Well, this was in the Goofus category. What that points out, though, I think, is the need, again, not in a back room kind of a sense, but the diplomacy and the tact and the level of trust that you need to build to execute these things. Again, between elected officials, business people, community leaders, is really critical. And you should think about how you act and the kinds of things you're thinking about, literally down to the who calls whom or who's at the head of the press conference or whatever. Does that add to or subtract from the level of trust that we're trying to build? Because without that level of trust, you're cooked. You'll fight your battles in the news media, and it becomes a did to, did not, kind of a high school schoolyard sort of a thing, and you get nowhere.
So this has to be very carefully orchestrated. And that's really, you walk a fine line because you want people out there who have bold vision, but you don't want them to have the appearance of grandstanding.
Right.
So everything has to be done.
Well, there is another piece to this. There are a number of communities, the Cleveland and Northeast Ohio being one of them, that have invested a lot of time, money, and effort into broad-scale community visioning efforts. Central Florida has done something like this as well, and Central Texas and Utah. Interestingly, mostly, with the exception of Cleveland, sort of fast-growing areas. And what they do there is really have these very rich and deep community conversations with literally thousands of people talking about our future and the kind of choices that we want to make. And it's kind of, one group described these as 21st century town meetings. So if you do those well, you're also building a platform. You're essentially building a parade that an elected official can get in front of. You're sort of answering the question, well, does anybody actually care about this stuff? Or if I did X, Y, Z, if I voted for X, Y, Z, would I be okay politically? So I think there's sort of a 1-2 punch. There's the kind of a leadership, community champions kind of a discussion, and then you can invest in this broad scale, anybody who wants to say anything, but not someone said about most about most public hearings, they neither involve the public nor hearing, which is unfortunately true. But these new efforts are really trying to recast that those kinds of initiatives, and I think have done it in a very productive way.
One final question, then we'll take questions from you folks. This is a higher tax region. Based on what you've seen when other metropolitan areas, other regions have taken some of these dramatic steps and have made changes and have agreed to collaborate, has it changed the tax climate much based on your experience? Because I think a lot of people here would love to hear somebody say, boy, what a difference it made.
Yep. The short answer is no. The tax issues are very difficult to attack at a regional scale for a number of reasons. And one thing is the more fragmented or compartmentalized your local governance is, the more difficult. And the more variable the tax burden from one community to the other within that. I'll use the example of Philadelphia, and we did a lot of work on that issue over the years. Philadelphia the region is really across 3 states and has about 350 municipalities. Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, is one of the highest taxed, both business and personal cities in the country. It's by some measure first, by some measure second or third. But also within that region, you had some of the lowest tax communities in the entire country. And so you had a huge spread. You combine that with there being 350 municipalities, and on the one hand, if you were glass half empty, you could say, well, people and businesses have lots of choices to make about where they live and do business. If you were more glass half full, you said, we are fighting against each other rather than fighting together against a common enemy. But the end of the story is that the city itself has been able to reduce its tax burdens. In fact, that's partly what got who's likely to be the next mayor elected, is his leadership on that issues. But it's never really been in the context of sort of regional tax sharing or some kind of a collaborative effort to rejigger the tax rates. The reason that I think tax issues are so tough is they're obviously the bread and butter revenue issues for local governments. And just as if, this is why tax issues are so important to all of us individually, because it's also a bread and butter issue for us. So you're really striking at the heart of, a manager's ability to deploy resources, or a school superintendent's ability to hire teachers and put supplies in the classroom, and so forth and so on. So I'm not sure I would choose that issue as, if I were putting the agenda of, what should we work at on a regional scale, I'm not sure I would put that one front and center. Transit, by the way, I would absolutely put front and center.
Why?
I think it is the quintessential regional issue, and it's going to get only more so. It's an economic issue because it's about people getting access to jobs and employers getting access to people. It's an environmental issue. That clearly, if you have a well-built, well-functioning transit system, you're not overbuilding roads, you're preserving open space and farmland, which people really care about. It's an energy issue. It's a homeland security issue. If you have a well-functioning transit system and all of a sudden you've got to evacuate, you're a lot better off. I mean, that fiasco, I think it was the storm that was threatened to hit after Katrina. And it was, what was it, Houston, or was it Dallas that had to evacuate?
Houston.
And people were on the highways for, 24 hours. So for all of those reasons, I think it's the quintessential regional issue.
Above all
Yeah.
all others?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other point I would say, I said earlier about, this sort of global competition, that authenticity is a really important thing. Access to markets and within a market. So this is more broadly transportation. Roads, bridges, transit, ports, airports are just hugely important now. I mean, I think they're just the front and center investment issues for metropolitan areas.
Let's take a few questions from the audience. If anybody has a question for David, feel free to ask. Ralph, yeah. Ralph is the head of the Urban League here.
Okay.
And I think that question was something that I thought about asking you. I think it's a very important point, because there are people, for example, who live in Waukesha County, which is due west of here, who say, what's in this for me? Why do I want to be a part of what's going on in Milwaukee?
Well, let me just make one point, which I really didn't address earlier, is that you have to define regional cooperation as not just, as you said earlier, I don't like the term regionalism. It's not a set of beliefs, although it's really, you have to frame it as problem solving. So the first question is, what are we trying to accomplish here? And then you go back to, you know, the lives and fortunes and future of families and residents and businesses in your communities. So, you know, part of the message is, how does the, you know, regional transit authority, the commuter rail line, the, you know, pick your, you know, the new water and sewer district benefit the lives of people in various communities. So you're not getting them, I think people have trouble wrapping their heads around, well, I mean, here's the reality. Regions are, you know, really don't exist as political entities by and large, and yet they're important to people, but they can't fuse their identity to any particular regional impetus, with the notable exception, by the way. And if you had to pick one thing that defines regions, it's sports teams, right? You could talk about Packer country, and Packer country would know no boundaries in terms of counties. You draw your, you know. But people have trouble seeing themselves as citizens of a region. They really care about their local. So to my mind, you don't try to get them to embrace that notion. It's really kind of a, again, back to your family, your fortunes, your future, your interest, and how does the change, the specific change that we're asking for affect that. It's really not even, it's really not even asking, you're not appealing even to necessarily to people's altruistic sense either. Although it's not a, I think you don't want to get too sort of mean-spirited and self-centered, you know. But it's a fine blend that you have to hit.
Other questions? Yes, Sister Joelle.
In any of the urban centers that have really achieved, I'm trying to avoid the word regionalism, economic development,
Right.
Would you say something about how they tackle the education system in their area?
Yeah.
Most urban centers do not
Yeah.
have high-performing education
Right.
systems.
Yeah. I mean, what you just said is the reality, which we all have to acknowledge. I mean, we just, in Philadelphia, had, for the last 6 years, Paul Vallis, the former CEO of the Chicago schools, was now off to New Orleans, front page of the New York Times. And the story on him in Philadelphia is starting with a system where, on average, basically a third of the kids were performing at standards. They're now up to maybe low 40s to mid 40s. Still a far cry from the 2/3, 80%, 85%, 100% that, you know, that we all want. So those are the toughest of the tough issues. And you know, I'll just sort of, this is not as much a reflection on the regional aspect, but one of the secrets, I think, to Vallis's game plan, and I think has been a productive one, is that they emphasized what someone said was a mix of fixes approach. You have, in Philadelphia, some universities that are running schools. You have about 10% of the kids in charter schools. You have reconstituted special schools that the district itself is running. And I think that responds to, without getting into the politics and the ideology, I think that responds to the interest of parents to find good schools for their kids, and that you give them some range of options under the popular structure. Having said that, I'm not aware of any schools that have sort of broken through even on that kind of game plan, have broken through to arrangements with suburban counties, except where you find consolidated school district. I mean, I mentioned Jefferson County in Kentucky, which 25 years ago went to a countywide school system, and Charlotte Mecklenburg has as well, and that opens up opportunity for kids.
And they tie it though to the economic development in any public way.
You know, I mean, that's always one of the big, high visibility, big ticket rationales for investing in education, period. I don't know the particulars of sort of the campaigns around those instances to see what kind of message they put to work.
Other questions? Yes, Dean. Mm-hmm.
2 and 3. One of them is, and I think this is also, this is unfortunately a regional issue that's not going to go away, is your, let's just call it your rapid response system. Call it Homeland Security, disaster preparedness, disaster recovery, making sure that you can, there was a report that came out a little earlier this summer about the inability of emergency systems in regions around the country to simply talk to one another, right? So it's very block and tackle kind of stuff. But if your mayor and your county executives and are not finding a way to to build the systems and the relationships so they can respond quickly, you're going to be in big trouble. So that's one that it's out there. It's going to be out there, and I think that's hugely important. I think maybe the last bucket is kind of the quality of life bucket, and here I would throw in parks, libraries, arts and culture. There are probably a half dozen significant regional cultural asset districts or regional funds for arts and culture: Denver, St. Louis, Charlotte, Pittsburgh, a couple others. Because I think that responds to people's basic sense of quality of life, and that they know that their quality of life is diminished if they can't get access to a park, or if they can't, if all of a sudden, if the city's paying for the art museum and the children's museum and the planetarium and so forth, and yet the visitors come from all around the region. There's a basic sense of fairness at work there, and then frankly, and this is what launched the whole effort in Pittsburgh. The city was in deep fiscal troubles and decided that they had to cut their appropriations to the zoo and the aviary and some others. So I think there's going to be growing interest in that, and partly that reflects the people now get that quality of life is an economic issue, and it's not just kind of a fluff. It really has to do with the quality of the place and how it positions itself around the globe, really.
How did some of those communities that did that succeed in doing that? Because even here today, I think the Milwaukee County Board was talking about having an advisory referendum vote that would allocate a penny on the dollar sales tax increase for a lot of what you just talked about,
right,
for parks, for,
right,
and yet there is strong resistance from the county executive here and strong resistance from other people. Say taxes are simply too high. We will not have any tax increases. How do you overcome that if you choose to overcome it?
Right. Well, I sort of go back to the playbook, although it's not it's not a playbook that's well understood. Mm-hmm. I was saying to you earlier that we turn to community problem solving, we invest an awful lot of time and effort into what I think of as the what questions, like what's the right answer? What is the policy, the structure that we pursue? And we don't pay as much attention to the how questions, which I think is really what you're asking to, is how do you drive change in this kind of murky, multi-jurisdictional, public-private? How do you do it over long periods of time? So part of the answer to that, and this is a good instinct as well, is you say, well, you ask that question and you bring in people from a Denver, from a Pittsburgh, from a Louisville, and get them focused on the sort of the process, the game plan, the strategy, the who did what, those how questions, or even go visit them. I mean, there's a growing interest around the country in a very productive way of these kind of interregional visits or inter-city visits of leaders, taking, you could call it a field trip to somewhere else. And those are the kind of conversations you can have, because they're nuances and they're subtleties which are really important. Like what I said earlier, who's at the press conference and who calls whom, and how do you, when you select the 3 co-chairs for the study commission, who are they, and how do you balance the field? There's a friend of mine refers to this as engineering change, which I like because it has a sense of sort of building blocks. But that, at the end of the day, is what will make one effort succeed and another fail.
Mm-hmm. Time for a question or two. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You're not talking about the sort of structural things, but the kind of projects advanced or yeah. Well, again, sort of close to home right now, our regional business leadership organization has done a very good job the last couple of years in building, in defining, this is on the marketing side, on defining a regional brand and then raising a good deal of money to get it out there. I mean, they raised about $16 million for a three-year regional marketing sort of an attraction campaign, and are going to the well again and seem to be enjoying some success. And their challenge particularly is they're working across 3 states. So building that connective tissue where it doesn't necessarily exist, I think, is a huge task. And there's so many different sort of flavors. I was struck. We put time and effort in Philadelphia, and I was a part of a group that was trying to actually put together, I thought, a very good bid for an Olympics game. And now, of course, Chicago's playing that game. I would count, that's a particular type of opportunity. It's kind of a known quantity. You have a limited amount of time. And I think any community that sort of makes it to, in that instance, it was Philadelphia, Chicago, the Bay Area, I think Houston and Dallas. And all of them, in a remarkably short period of time, and spending all private money, by the way, put together very credible bids. On the capital side, I think any time. Well, I was going to make some reference to the big dig in Boston, the $16 billion capital project, which I think started out as a $2 billion capital project. And we're all paying for it, by the way, the taxpayers in the United States. There's actually a pretty good book written about the process that resulted in that outcome. And it's hard to argue with the scale of that ambition and that success, at least in terms of whether or not they can keep the tiles from falling off the tunnel there is another question. I guess one other thing I'd point out, which is most of these are sort of evolving and aborning, but in Louisville and southern Indiana, they've got a pretty effective regional leadership coalition that's trying to get together around building a couple $1 billion worth of bridges across the Ohio River there, and is obviously spanning 2 states as well. Again, just to tick them off on the cultural front, Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri came together around a capital project to
that had to be a bi-state. They passed a bi-state tax to create they took their old railroad station in Kansas City, Missouri, and turned it into a new science museum. So, you know, there are two types of projects that you can do. There's the capital projects, which have advantages to them, and then there are the kind of policy change. I suppose there are three, and then there's the structural things, and they all have kind of pluses and minuses. And one of the arts, I think, in doing this long term is sort of building the portfolio so that you're not just keep doing one kind of thing. I would say one more question or thought about collaboration. You know, the Alliance for Regional Stewardship, which I was running for the last year and a half, really was preaching this gospel of collaboration and collaborative problem solving and so forth. And I got an email. We tossed off some newsletter and all that sort of stuff. And I got an email from somebody who said, essentially, yeah. He said, look, collaboration is really, really hard work. And everybody, you know, sort of genuflects at the altar of collaboration. But he said, one thing that we know, and this is both sort of research and experience, one thing we know about collaboration is it tends to be, the most effective way to organize it is to find people who have been effective in collaborating on one project and get them working on another one. In other words, you don't want to like, this is like having a pickup team, a pickup basketball team going down the court, and then the very next time you go down the court, you pick up a whole new pickup team. So, I mean, this is, again, to go back to people who have demonstrated, you know, their ability to build trust and stature and so forth, and redeploy them in an artful way from one thing to the next, I think sounds like it's an effective way to go.
So your final thoughts for a region like Milwaukee, if it had to, and I think you mentioned it's important to focus.
Yeah.
What would you say as people move forward with issues like water, with transit, those sorts of things?
Yeah.
I'll give you the final word here.
Right. Well, I'll end where I began. I think you should be very optimistic and confident about not only your collection of assets, and I talked about impressionistically about what seemed to me to be some of your assets, including that little body of water out there, which we really talk about. But what looks like your efforts to organize around that, and I think the long-term presence of the Greater Milwaukee Committee, this imaginative, collaborative of the Milwaukee 7, I think you should be proud of that, and I think there's great possibility. And the only other thing is it goes back to the stick-to-itiveness and the staying power. Somehow the ability to sustain these efforts. You know, you say like, why can't we get that, you know, that regional commuter rail thing done? I mean, we've been talking about that forever. Well, forever it's just going to have to get a little longer. But these things are doable. I mean, I think, you know, as probably some of you, you know, kind of am fascinated by history and the lessons of history. You know, most things, we tend to reflect on big things that happened at some point and think like, well, that must have been easy. It was a piece of cake. A couple people got together and made it happen, and, you know, so forth and so on. That's never been the case, and it never will be the case. So we should take comfort in that, I think, not be sort of dismayed by that fact. And then it's just a matter of, you know, keep pitching in a very focused and pragmatic sense.
Mm-hmm. David, we appreciate your time today and your thoughts. Thanks,
Sure.
Thanks very much for being with us today.
My pleasure, and good luck.
Well, thank you again, Mike and David. It's been a pretty great noon with Mike Gousha and David Thornburgh. So I appreciated your words of wisdom, too. You know, actually, it's a little comforting to hear what you have to say, because we've been, I think, trying to knit things together here for a couple of years now and keep it moving and feeling like we have traction, and yet, you know, we're still an older industrial area that's trying to make a big transition into a different economy for ourselves. So I appreciate your words of wisdom. And I also want to thank our guest and audience for being with us today, and thank the MATA Community Media, which came over on short notice to do our filming today. So this is also will be captured on our website, and I think we're going to put the MP3 out to some different venues as well. So thank you very much.